This video is the second in a series of video lectures that I am making for the Bay Area Waldorf teacher training program for the first year students. Actually, last time I said third year students, my mistake, who I am joining to explore Rudolf Steiner's The Philosophy of Freedom. And in this video, I will be covering chapters 1 through 4, giving a summary. So those chapters are consecutively Chapter 1, Conscious Human Action, Chapter 2, The Fundamental Desire for Knowledge, Chapter 3, Thinking in the Service of Knowledge, and Chapter 4, The World as Percept. And to begin, I'd like to do just a little bit of review, which is customary for the Waldorf approach to education, and go back over the two questions or the two aims that Steiner opens the 1918 edition preface with. And I'm sharing here an alternative translation of those two aims or questions so that we can have multiple translations. Just helps us to get deeper, I think, at what was meant in the German as English speakers. So Friedrich Amrine, that's who this translation is coming from, writes, translating Steiner, I have attempted to show that there is a view of human nature which can provide support for all remaining knowledge. Moreover, I sought to indicate that with this view, full justification is gained for the idea of the freedom of the will, if only the realm of the soul is found within which free will can unfold. So that's a bit different than the way they're translated in this text, where they're posed more as questions rather than presented as aims. But you get the idea, and I think it clarifies a bit more what was somewhat confusing in the Wilson translation when he says, is it possible to find a view of the essential nature of man such as will give us a foundation for everything else that comes to meet us, whether through life experience or through science, which we feel is otherwise not self-supporting and therefore liable to be driven by doubt and criticism into the realm of uncertainty? So what comes out in comparing these two translations is that in the Michael Wilson translation, it wasn't quite clear based on the structure of that sentence, even though I think it's implicit that what he was referring to is knowledge. Is there some view of human nature that can give us a support for all remaining knowledge, some kind of confidence in knowing? And as I mentioned in the introductory lecture where I went over a brief history of Western ideas with respect to these two questions, there is a kind of echo of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, and his insistence on thinking. But as we'll see, Steiner will make a different conclusion than Descartes does about the nature of thinking, though it will be essential to this foundation for knowledge. So in chapter 1, Conscious Human Action, Steiner opens the text by just acknowledging that for philosophers over the last 500 years, the question of whether we are free or not has been argued passionately for and against. So there are those who find it self-evident that, especially starting from the human experience, that of course freedom is a reality, whereas there are many proponents of the idea that everything unfolds according to necessity, who are very much inspired by natural science and the possibility of reproducing experiments which do show that there are universal laws that typically produce predictable results. As we'll see, Steiner's monism that he'll eventually offer throughout the text, we could say is a more qualified position on this question, because for him, we can both say that we are unfree and also have the possibility of undertaking action that is consciously motivated and so free, and that we have this potential, therefore, to become more free. He then goes on to point out that many of the arguments against freedom have conflated consciously motivated action with the freedom of mere choice. Those who dismiss the idea of freedom when conflated with the idea of mere freedom of choice claim that there's always some kind of most reasonable course of action in every circumstance that one might meet, such that to speak of freedom in that way is somewhat meaningless, that there's some kind of necessity behind every choice. And Steiner then goes on to say that This argument has been rehashed since it was first most lucidly set forth by Spinoza in his notion of free necessity, where everything in the cosmos, as I touched upon in my summary of the last 500 years of philosophy, meager summary, Spinoza's vision of this sort of world mechanism where the only free being is God, because God exists as a kind of free necessity, whereas everything else in the cosmos acts according to the causes that are outside of it that ultimately root back to God. One might ask Spinoza, what really is the difference between the notion of a divinity that is free necessity and the externally determined creatures like we humans and rocks and birds and what have you? But we'll leave that aside. Steiner then goes on to quote Spinoza, comparing human action, the thirst of an infant for milk, or someone reacting out of hostility. Any kind of human action is comparable to the trajectory that a stone takes when it's thrown or kicked or what have you. And even if the stone were to be conscious like a human being and think that it's intending its own movement, it's actually moving according to a kind of necessity that was imposed upon it from without. And the same is true for human beings and all our actions. Steiner finds Spinoza's articulation of this view of freedom of choice as actually some kind of necessity that we're not aware of commendable because it's so simply expressed, and so the error is more evident. And for him, that error basically boils down to an unwillingness to make important distinctions between humans and stones or other animals, for example. And on the other hand, within human experience itself, actions that we undertake unfreely and don't understand why we undertake them, and those that are consciously motivated. So Steiner concludes, Spinoza and all who think like him overlook the fact that man or the human being not only is conscious of his action, but also may become conscious of the causes which guide him. So Steiner wants to make a distinction between consciously motivated actions and actions that we undertake out of some kind of compulsion. Here's an example. Let's imagine a scenario where there is a person who grew up with parents that were really chaotic, not very present, and left their child feeling anxious a lot of the time. And so this child grows up to be an adult who has what they call anxious attachment. And so they have a hard time trusting other people and expect a similar kind of chaos from their partners. But let's say they meet a partner who has a very secure form of attachment and is very stable, but this person, this first person that we mentioned, is bringing their former experience of growing up with chaotic people, and so doesn't trust their partner initially, even though their partner time and time again shows them that they are to be trusted. And so this person with the insecure attachment, anxious attachment, might be compelled by their former experience, maybe which they didn't understand until they went to therapy, to excessively check with their partner, seeking some kind of reassurance. You do love me, right? You do love me, right? But then in going to therapy and learning more about this notion of attachment and their own experience, reflecting on their own experience growing up with chaotic parents, and learning about this possibility of developing secure attachment, this idea of secure attachment, and kind of what goes along with that, trusting people who show you time and time again that they should be trusted, and not allowing oneself to be driven by those thoughts that are sort of welling up from the past, to then change their behavior motivated by this consciously chosen ideal to step into a more secure form of attachment. That's one example. We could think of so many. But if we refuse to make any kind of distinction between consciously motivated actions and compulsory actions, then we couldn't really make sense of the possibility for change unless the possibility for change was written in the stars from the beginning. And then it sort of makes it meaningless. And this is an interesting segue into another argument against freedom, coming now from a philosopher that was alive during the same time as Steiner, who he had a lot of admiration for, Edward von Hartmann. and his notion of characterological determination. So we could say, if you're familiar with the temperaments, I'm a sanguine. I always act this way. And because I have this character, or maybe I'm a Libra if you're into astrology, or maybe I'm an ENFP if you're into Myers-Briggs. Any kind of characterological typology we could use could point to that and be like, this is why I'm inwardly determined this way to choose certain motivations. And so I'm not actually free. I'm actually determined from within and perhaps also from without as well. Here again, as Steiner writes, the difference between motives which I allow to influence me only after I have permeated them with my consciousness and those which I follow without any clear knowledge of them is absolutely ignored. This permeation in consciousness that Steiner refers to will be bound up with our capacity to freely think. But what does it mean to have knowledge of the reasons for one's actions? Steiner asks. He then goes on to acknowledge some prevailing ideas of how people think about this. He says, it is said that man is free when he is controlled only by his reason and not by his animal passions. Or again, that to be free means to be able to determine one's life and action by purposes and deliberate decisions. But this could just be another form of compulsion, this time coming from the mental pole and maybe bound up with ways in which one was punished or taught abstractly what is right or wrong to do, which constitutes another kind of unfreedom, similar to being driven by more unconscious compulsions that may have more to do with instinct. Steiner then proceeds to consider another argument against freedom. And what Steiner's doing here is really important as a philosopher. We could say that he's holding the pole of doubt. He has this mission to argue for the reality of freedom, but he's considering all the arguments against it. And this next argument comes from someone named Robert Hammerling, who says, man can certainly do as he wills, but he cannot want as he wills, because his wanting is determined by motives. It is, I'm skipping, therefore quite true that the human will is not free, inasmuch as its direction is always determined by the strongest motive. So not only is there a kind of conflation of desire with motive, but as Steiner says, here again, only motives in general are mentioned without taking into account the difference between unconscious and conscious motives. So over and over again, Steiner is insisting on the importance of being able to make distinctions between different kinds of actions, at least for humans. The primary question, Steiner says, is not whether I can do a thing or not when a motive has worked upon me, but whether there are any motives except such as impel me without absolute necessity. So are there motives that I can consciously select for myself? Can I select to aspire to act in such a way, or to only entertain certain thoughts, to give my attention to certain thoughts that will move me towards secure attachment, for example? Or is something else doing that for me? Or am I forever doomed to be anxiously attached? Steiner then goes on to make a distinction between human beings and animals by claiming that human beings exercise rational thinking. And someone might, make the argument, well, how can we know that human beings have rational thinking and other animals don't? For those who are less familiar with Steiner's worldview and the way that he believed to be expanding Goethe's method, one could look at the human form and read possibly this capacity for rational thinking off our human form to the extent that, unlike other animals, we are like our hands are less specialized, sort of left open, and need the supplement of culture in order to survive. If you compare the human hand with the wing of a bird or with the claw of some other kind of creature, they're more specialized to have a kind of technological purchase on the world. We have to create our own tools. And so we could think of the capacity for rational thinking as also this expression of our being separate from the world, having this experience of being separated out from it and still one with it, whereas other creatures, in their instinctual understanding of how to inhabit the world, we could say maybe their instinct and thinking are continuous. He then goes on to consider the conflation of human willing with animal behavior, and even conflating animal behavior with the movement of a stone. Steiner, even though he doesn't dwell on it here, would make distinctions between all of those, not claiming that the donkey, for instance, is just some kind of machine moving like a rock, much less a human. Because if human beings were so determined, we wouldn't be concerned with justice. We wouldn't think it right to deal any kind of punishment or reprimand to people who have done something wrong. We also wouldn't treat other animals differently than we treat ourselves. Why is it that we don't hold a dog, for instance, or a cat accountable for killing something in the same way that we would a human? It's an important question to ask. Steiner reiterates once more that there is an unwillingness to recognize the distinction between consciously motivated actions and compulsory actions. So he says, but what about an action for which the reasons are known? And this leads us to the question of the origin and meaning of thinking, which he will take up throughout the rest of the book. And this is a kind of hint at that first question in the preface of the 1918 edition. Is there something that we can understand about human nature that can give us some kind of confidence in the possibility of genuinely knowing the world and also knowing whether or not we can freely act in it? But then Steiner wants to qualify this characterization of human nature and says, I am very far from calling human in the highest sense only those actions that proceed from abstract judgment. This is where desire and feelings and love come in. But he says when it comes to humans who have this capacity for rational thinking, feelings are bound up with thoughts, and that thought can be the guide to noble feelings, the guide to transforming desires that maybe aren't so good for us into desires for something higher. And so, just to give another example, someone from class had a book based on Steiner's, what are called in the anthroposophical world, 6 basic exercises. And one of them is positivity, which basically means seeing the good in everything. And that's a kind of thought process that informs one's feelings. So Steiner says, whenever it is not merely the expression of bare sexual instinct, it depends on the mental picture we form of the loved one, how we think of them, how we feel towards them. And the more idealistic these mental pictures are, just so much the more blessed is our love. So we could think when he says mental picture, as we'll get to, this is a kind of combination of like our image of someone that we know and our thinking about them, our capacity to, through observation, recognize good things about them and to focus on that. And the more idealistic these mental pictures are, just so much the more blessed is our love. Here too, thought is the father of feeling, or the mother. It is said that love makes us blind to the failings of the loved one, but this can be expressed the other way around, namely, that it is just for the good qualities that love opens the eyes. Many pass by these good qualities without noticing them. One, however, perceives them, or another perceives them, and just because he does, love awakens in the soul. What else has he done but made a mental picture of what hundreds have failed to see? Love is not theirs because they lack the mental picture. So, this emphasis on the mental picture helps us also to see that when Steiner's talking about thinking, he's also talking about what we call imagination, like a kind of active imagining that includes image. So, like our internalization of the world in memory and our thoughts about and woven with those images. Now to chapter 2, the fundamental desire for knowledge. And Steiner opens the chapter with this quote because what he then will begin to talk about is the state that we most, I would say, human beings find ourselves in, which is this experience of being a self over against a world that we feel that we are somehow a part of, but also feel that we don't fully know or understand. This experience of feeling incomplete, and desire is the expression of this incompleteness, but also this being related to, being one with, but also experiencing a kind of separation. And he says the pursuit of knowledge or the desire for knowledge is one expression of this limitation that is expressed in desire. So the desire for knowledge is one expression of the way in which we as human beings are constituted. Someone might say, well, animals have desires too, right? But it might be more accurate to say actually that animals have needs that they seek to satiate. Whereas when we speak of desire with respect to human beings, there's something almost infinite about it, or that it reflects some kind of awareness of the infinite. And I think something like addiction, which animals only really fall into in proximity to humans, is a kind of expression of this sort of intuition of the infinite. And even this pursuit of knowledge itself is this awareness of the infinite and this potential aspiration to encompass the whole through the pursuit of knowledge, or at least to deepen towards an ever ongoing adventure in knowing the world as a being, which when we relate to the world as a being, we then don't fall under the illusion that we could ever completely know it, because we never fall or shouldn't fall under the illusion that we could ever know completely the depths of another human being or any other creature. So this situation creates the I world polarity. And for Steiner, the I, capital I, what we use as the first person pronoun, has a kind of metaphysical meaning to it. It's continuous with the way that we mean it in everyday speech. But when he says I, henceforward, he means something like the aspect of ourselves, of our subjectivity, of our consciousness that is the observer. It's not identified with the personality per se. It can even observe the personality, which we express our personality, but it is more, the I is that aspect of ourselves that is the observer, the witness. And it's in consciousness, or you could say in spirit. And we come to consciousness of that through counterpointing the world. And this pursuit of knowledge reflects our feeling that we are still part of the world and that we would like to somehow reunite with it. And Steiner, following Goethe, writes, only when we have made the world content into our thought content do we again find the unity out of which we had separated ourselves. He then goes on to discuss ways in which philosophers have attempted to grapple with this situation in metaphysics. So, metaphysics is that aspect of philosophy that tries to describe the most fundamental character of the world. And the dualist perspective assumes that the I is the representative in our experience of spirit and the world that we experience without matter, and they're irreconcilable. Whereas monist perspectives would either reduce all to spirit or all to matter, or to some kind of atomism where everything is a combination of both, but they still don't speak to each other. They're still irreconcilable. Steiner argues that materialism can never offer a satisfactory explanation of the world, for every attempt at an explanation must begin with the formation of thoughts about the phenomena of the world. And this might seem counterintuitive to many of us who have been raised to think in materialistic terms, because when we're raised to think that way, conditioned to think that way, which most, I think, of the world is now today, of course, there are exceptions, we unconsciously assume that matter or the material world is more fundamental than consciousness or spirit. And even if we don't consciously think that way, we might still act that way. But Steiner says materialism is inadequate because all theory, every time we begin to come up with some kind of explanation of the world, we're already starting with thinking. And so there's some kind of contradiction in claiming that thinking is less fundamental than the material world. Spiritualism, on the other hand, doesn't work either, because the very possibility of knowledge or knowing the world at all relies upon, at least as we experience it now, some relationship with a material or outer world. And the same goes with action. As we experience life now, our thoughts can only translate themselves into action through embodied actions, or at least by taking some kind of effect in the physical world. That's at least what Steiner's claiming here. He might have a more complex way of framing things later on in his esoteric work. Steiner then near the conclusion of the chapter, says, against all these theories, we must urge the fact that we meet with the basic and primary opposition first in our own consciousness, so between spirit and world, or spirit and matter. It is we ourselves who break away from the bosom of nature and contrast ourselves as I with the world. So what he's saying here is that this dualism or this opposition between spirit, identified with the I, and world is something that may not be actually ultimately characteristic of the world itself, but is something that we introduce through our mental organization, as he'll later say. This combination of our capacity to think and to perceive the world through our bodies. And in closing the chapter, he draws once more again on this desire that is this reflection of our actually being one with nature and feeling compelled to move towards some kind of reunion. He says, however true it may be that we have estranged ourselves from nature, it is none the less true that we feel we are in her and belong to her. It can be only her own working which pulsates also in us. We must find the way back to her again. A simple reflection can point this way out to us. We have, it is true, torn ourselves away from nature, but we must none the less have taken something of her with us into our own being. This element of nature in us we must seek out, and then we shall find the connection with her. This element of nature in us we must seek out, and then we shall find the connection with her once more. We can find nature outside us only if we have first learned to know her within us. What is akin to her within us must be our guide. This marks our path of inquiry. And as chapter 3 suggests, that guide will be thinking in the service of knowledge. So Steiner opens this chapter by making a distinction between two different phases in the act of getting to know the world. The first being observation, so attending to what is given to us by experience, the objects, which could also include, as we'll see, our own feelings and prior thoughts, and then our contemplative reflection upon that, or our analysis of that experience, breaking it down into parts, different concepts, and any process of explanation that follows upon that, where we then build up a bigger picture of the whole, or try to build towards the whole, but now illuminated with concepts showing the connections between things. So implied in what I just described is a distinction between that which is given, does not depend upon us, and then this active process of analysis or contemplative reflection that requires our activity and that we're aware of doing when we intend to do it. As surely as the occurrence goes on independently of me, writes Steiner, so surely is the conceptual process unable to take place without my assistance. And at this point, Steiner just wants to bracket the question as to whether or not this thinking activity that seems to be of our own intention, our own will, whether it actually is ours or not. He wants to bracket that for now. Steiner then emphasizes something that he'll go on to repeat, and I think I've already mentioned before, that concepts are not given immediately in observation, and concepts are what allow us to connect the disparate aspects of an observation together such that we can come to understand it. In the opening part of the chapter, he brings the example of the shooting of a billiard ball and just the trajectory that it takes in space, and then describes this process of reflecting upon what was observed afterwards with certain concepts that he would have already gained through personal experience, studying science, conducting experiments, concepts like velocity, elasticity, ball, and that these combined in a certain way can yield an understanding of what would happen if a person was standing in this particular place, shooting the ball a particular way, hitting other balls. One might even be able to predict the outcome of that situation without observing it. So with this example, Steiner demonstrates that what thinking supplies us is an understanding of the otherwise mysterious connection between the various constituents of what we observe with our senses. Steiner then goes on to describe this continuum of observation and thinking. You could think of it as this dynamic form like a limnoscape as being the most basic polarity from which all of the metaphysical dualisms that philosophers have come up with, or polarities, arise. Observation and thinking are the 2 points of departure for all the spiritual striving of man, insofar as he is conscious of such striving, writes Steiner. This exemplifies the way in which Steiner's approach to philosophy is what could be described as a phenomenological one. He wants to start in human experience. And he says that all of these other polarities that people have come up with start from this experienced polarity of observation and thinking. And in this dynamic, Steiner says that observation always comes first and thinking after, at least when we're talking about thinking as the reflective activity on said observations. Everything that enters the circle of our experience, writes Steiner, we first become aware of through observation. The content of sensation, perception, and contemplation, all feelings, acts of will, dreams, and fancies, mental pictures, concepts, and ideas, all illusions and hallucinations are given to us through observation. So this is significant because he's not just saying that it's what we perceive through our senses or what we experience through our feelings. It's also the reflective activity itself is a kind of observation of past ideas and concepts. So ideas and concepts are also things that we can observe. And just a little footnote for those pursuing the Waldorf method of teaching, as I understand it, the approach is to start with experience and then later on, after students have had an experience, maybe a science experiment, or they're observing something, or they're experiencing a poem, to then only later on reflect upon it in a more intellectual way. So already we have here in Steiner's characterization of observation coming before thinking the roots of this approach. Steiner then goes on to make a distinction between all those other objects of observation and thinking, which he claims is essentially different from all other objects of observation. Whereas observation of things and events and thinking about them are everyday occurrences filling up the continuous current of my life, writes Steiner, observation of the thinking itself is a kind of exceptional state. And then he continues a bit further on. We must be quite clear about the fact that in observing thinking, we are applying to it a procedure which constitutes the normal course of events for the study of the whole rest of the world content, everything that we feel and experience without, but which in the normal course of events is not applied to thinking itself. In other words, when we're observing the world, we're more typically aware of what we're observing and not also the fact that we are simultaneously thinking what we're observing. We are not typically conscious of the fact that our thinking is participating in the constitution of what we perceive. The last time I shared an image that helps us to become conscious of that fact because we could perceive one of two things. We could either perceive the rabbit looking to the right or the duck looking to the left. And this makes us aware of the fact that when we are perceiving something that we recognize as a distinct thing that we could name, we are also at the same time contributing thoughts to that object of perception. So Steiner describes this awareness of thinking at work in perception as the exceptional state. We could also describe it as contemplative observation. For those interested in Owen Barfield, Goethe, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, we could describe it as conscious figuration or a systematic approach to making the primary imagination a conscious experience. But for those who are not familiar with that terminology, don't even worry about it. Steiner will call this living thinking. He'll also call it imagination. Then Steiner takes up the pole of doubt and asks, anticipating a question a critic might have for him, how is thinking essentially different than our experience of feeling? And this helps to further elucidate what is characteristic about thinking, to the extent that it's something that we at least seem to experience ourselves as willfully doing. A feeling of pleasure, for instance, Steiner claims, does not stand at all in the same relation to its object as the concept formed by thinking. I am conscious in the most positive way that the concept of a thing is formed through my activity, whereas pleasure is produced in me by an object in the same way as, for instance, a change is caused in an object by a stone which falls on it. For observation, a pleasure is given in exactly the same way as the event which causes it. The same is not true of the concept. I can ask why a particular event arouses in me a feeling of pleasure, but I certainly cannot ask why an event produces in me a particular set of concepts. The question would be simply meaningless. So, what Steiner means here is that, as he's repeated before, intuitions or concepts are not given in observation, but rather require us to reflect or analyze on what was observed in order to conceptually distinguish the different aspects of our experience. And as I mentioned before, concepts come with time. So, for instance, one only arrives at the concept of a rose in particular through having repeatedly encountered the flower rose and achieved the capacity to conceptually distinguish between a rose and a violet, for instance. The observation is necessary for us in order to be able to conceptually distinguish these things later on, but we can't derive the concepts from our sense perception itself. Whereas in the feeling of pleasure or any other kind of feeling, on the other hand, is something that issues more or less from the objects themselves. And also, of course, as we'll see, is a factor of our personality, which is not the same as I mentioned in the former summary as the I or the observer, which is participating in this process of conceptual distinction. As Steiner writes, when I say of an observed object, this is a rose, I say absolutely nothing about myself. But when I say of the same thing that it gives me a feeling of pleasure, I characterize not only the rose, but also myself in relation to the rose. We could clarify this by pointing out that though it might be surprising, it's not hard to imagine that there may be some people for whom the smell of a rose or the sight of a rose isn't a pleasurable experience, even though it may be for many. Whereas for all, the concept of the rose, that this is a rose, will be the same. How we feel about it, on the other hand, that is particular. So there again, we have this distinction between the observing I and the personality. And by I, remember, I mean capital I, the first personal pronoun. And to take this distinction between feeling and thinking further, we could say that in the experience of feeling, there's also thinking going on to the extent that we could describe what we're feeling and why, the pleasure stimulated by the smell of the rose. And there's thinking going on there that we're unaware of. And so, yet again, thinking is that aspect of our experience that we are actively contributing, but not aware of in our active observation because it is our activity. And the fact that it's our activity, but we're concerned with the objects, whether there are feelings or the objects with which the feelings are connected with, the rose, we then aren't aware of the fact that we're also contributing our thinking. But even if we were to enter what Steiner describes as the exceptional state, where we become aware of the fact that in observing the rose, I'm also thinking the rose, this is always only ever after we've produced the thought. So Steiner will claim that, as with the sequence of observation and reflective thinking, we are only ever able to reflect upon prior thoughts. In other words, Steiner writes, while I am thinking, I pay no heed to my thinking, which is of my own making, but only to the object of my thinking, which is not of my making. I am, moreover, in the same position when I enter into the exceptional state and reflect on my own thinking. I can never observe my present thinking. I can only subsequently take my experiences of my thinking process as the object of fresh thinking. He then draws on Genesis, where God is said to have created the world in 6 days and then called it good, as a kind of picture for expressing this. What in all other spheres of observation, Steiner writes, can be found only indirectly, namely the relevant context and the relationship between the individual objects, is in the case of thinking known to us in an absolutely direct way. I do not on the face of it know why, for my observation, thunder follows lightning, but I know directly from the very content of the two concepts why my thinking connects the concept of thunder with the concept of lightning. He then takes up the pole of doubt, addressing those who would say that, well, actually, our tendency to connect these concepts is actually just a factor of our brain processes. Steiner's like, wait a minute, you're leaving behind thinking, which is also what you're using to make the claims about the brain processes. He says, what I observe about thinking is not what process in my brain connects the concept lightning with the concept thunder, but what causes me to bring the two concepts into a particular relationship. My observation shows me that in linking one thought with another, there is nothing to guide me but the content of my thoughts. I am not guided by any material processes in my brain. And so remember at the start of the book, Steiner says one of his questions is whether or not we can identify something essential about the human being that we can make the starting point for any kind of solid knowledge about the world. And of course, this for him is thinking. So, in comparison to the materialist, Steiner says, for everyone, however, who has the ability to observe thinking, and with goodwill, every normal man or woman or person has this ability, this observation is the most important one he or she or they possibly can make. For he observes something of which he himself is the creator. And then a little bit further, a firm point, he concludes, has now been reached from which one can, with some hope of success, seek an explanation of all other phenomena of the world. And so here in this claim that observation of thinking is a starting point, we hear once again this echo of Descartes. And of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, Steiner says, all that he had any right to assert was that within the whole world content, I apprehend myself and my thinking as in that activity which is most uniquely my own, or at least it seems to be. It seems to be dependent on our volition, whether or not we are going to get to know the world. And also it's something that we're contributing, or at least seem to be. The difference between the human subject as a thinking subject and all other objects is that their essence, at least for us as creatures who can come to understand things, which is also bound up with our separation from them, that these other things must be understood in connection with other things. But the starting point for that adventure in knowing the world begins, at least for us, with our own thinking activity. So Steiner writes, my investigation touches firm ground only when I find an object which exists in a sense which I can derive from the object itself. But I am myself such an object in that I think, for I give to my existence the definite self-determined content of thinking activity. So we could say the thinking subject is self-subsistent, that its activity is qualitatively identical with itself, he says. So when I think about thinking, I'm reflecting on a process that itself gave rise to what I'm reflecting upon. So, for example, when we do the concentration exercise, this is a kind of intensified awareness of what's going on all the time when we're perceiving the outer world. And we can become more aware of the fact that there's something, some kind of productive activity that gives rise to those fresh thoughts that well up as if out of some kind of spring. For example, thinking about a pencil, the pencil is a cylinder, the pencil has a pink eraser. These thoughts just well up out of our intending to think the object that we're focusing on at that moment. This is connected with the seemingly enigmatic quote that Steiner shares from the philosopher Friedrich Schelling, who was a German idealist, one of the German idealists. To know nature means to create nature. And then Steiner goes on to say, if we take these words of this bold nature philosopher literally, we shall have to renounce forever all hope of gaining knowledge of nature, because then we would have to create nature before we could know it. But then we would have to know it in order to create it in the first place. Instead, in claiming that what Schelling was saying shouldn't be taken literally, Steiner is saying that to know nature requires our creative activity, namely creating before knowing, we achieve in the case of thinking. Were we to refrain from thinking until we had first gained knowledge of it, we would never come to it at all. We must resolutely plunge right into the activity of thinking, so that afterwards, by observing what we have done, we may gain knowledge of it. For the observation of thinking, we ourselves first create an object. The presence of all other objects is taken care of without any activity on our part. So that's why we can make it the basis for our adventures in knowing the world. So again, what's implied here in claiming that there's this sort of processual relationship between observation and thinking, that there is a kind of thoughtfulness laden in what we experience through observation that we can further illuminate upon reflection later on. He then takes up the pole of doubt with respect to those who would say, well, what we unconsciously contribute to that which we perceive is much different than what we actually experience. And so, how can we trust our thinking? And Steiner acknowledges that every thinker is situated, and he'll say more about this again in chapter 4, in such a way that we are limited in what we can think, but with reference to our situatedness, so our particularity, our position in time and space, and our cultural conditioning, with reference to all that, the thoughts are still valid. And this suggests that in order to have a more comprehensive picture of the whole, we would need to bring many perspectives together, which is what science and all the disciplines taken together aspire to do. He then takes up another criticism, that being the question as to why one would start with thinking rather than consciousness, since thinking presupposes consciousness. Then Steiner says, well, let's be clear about what we're trying to do here. So, coming back to that first question he posed in the preface, is it possible to gain some understanding of the human being such that we can have some kind of confidence in our aspirations to know the world? And what is that? To know the world, not to create it, even though our thinking is a creative activity. And then Steiner replies in a somewhat sassy way, to this, I must reply that in order to clear up the relation between thinking and consciousness, I must think about it. So there's a distinction he acknowledges between the creation of the world and the consciousness that thinking presupposes and the enterprise of knowledge. He says, we must first consider thinking quite impartially, without reference to a thinking subject or a thought object. For both subject and object are concepts formed by thinking. There is no denying that before anything else can be understood, thinking must be understood, because thinking is that by which we make things understood, that through which we understand things. Whoever denies this fails to realize that man or the human being is not the first link in the chain of creation, but the last. And he doesn't mean this in a Darwinian sense. As long as philosophy goes on assuming all sorts of basic principles, he says further on, such as atom, motion, matter, will, or the unconscious, it will hang in the air. Only if the philosopher recognizes that which is last in time as his first point of attack can he reach his goal. This absolutely last thing at which world evolution has arrived is, in fact, thinking. So, what he means is that similar to the active observation and the creative activity of thinking that contributes itself to observation, such that we are able to perceive things rather than just chaos, and then only later reflect upon it and illuminate it conceptually such that we can understand it. The same goes with the whole process of creation, that the human is that creature that turns back and wakefully looks on the whole dreaming process of natural evolution. He then takes up the pole of doubt once more and acknowledges the criticism of those who would question whether we could say thinking is correct or incorrect. This might be a claim made by those who would characterize thinking as just some kind of survival mechanism that doesn't have actually any purchase on the real, which would be contrary to science. But Steiner says that this doesn't make any sense. Thinking is self-evident. For instance, the rose is a rose. There may be in different languages different words for the concept rose, or the concept that we designate with in English with the word rose, but there is nonetheless that concept, and that's a fact of thinking. The question is not whether thinking is right or wrong, it's whether or not we're applying thinking in a correct way. Now for chapter 4, the world as percept, which Steiner opens by exploring further what concepts are and how we go about intuiting them. So as he writes, when someone sees a tree, for instance, his or her thinking reacts to his observation. An ideal element is added to the object, and he or she considers the object and the ideal counterpart as belonging together. The ideal counterpart being that which grants it meaning in a larger context. When the object disappears from his or her field of observation, only the ideal counterpart of it remains. This latter is the concept of the object. The more our range of experience is widened, the greater becomes the sum of our concepts. But concepts certainly do not stand isolated from one another. They combine to form a systematically ordered whole. So that's a really important statement because it just makes evident that concepts by themselves are always abstract. And if we hearken back to Steiner's brief characterizations of the human as being bound up with nature but separated out from her, though bringing something of her with us, and that something that we brought with us may be our guide back into a kind of unity with nature, that our aspiration to expand our range of concepts, that expands our reach, our grasp of the whole, is part of this process of reuniting ourselves with nature. So paradoxically, that which has helped to separate us from nature and awaken self-consciousness is also the means by which we reunite and retain self-consciousness for Steiner. And then he makes a point to say that his starting point rather than concepts is thinking. And so again, rather than treat concepts as abstractions, kind of like units that build up to a picture of the world, it's more that the growth of concepts for us enhances our capacity to read the meaning, the dynamic meaning in the world, to participate in the meaning, the speaking of the world, and the speaking of life. So in a sense, what Steiner's trying to invite us into is a kind of reading of the world and of our own experience. And in continuity with what he said before about observation coming prior to thinking, you could say experience coming before knowledge. He says that concepts come with experience, it's developmental. And to draw once more on your earlier reading of The Kingdom of Childhood, Steiner's one of his lecture cycles dedicated to the Waldorf approach, he says in that lecture that it's important to give the students mobile concepts that can continue to evolve later in their life when they accumulate experience, rather than providing concepts that maybe aren't appropriate for that age and then don't allow them to continue to grow in their wisdom. So one example I remember from the lecture cycle is Steiner being critical of certain ways of depicting plants, for example, or teaching botany as if plants were separate from the earth. But he says that it's better to help the students see plants as being a kind of outgrowth of the earth itself, so that eventually they grow into an experience of the earth as a living being itself. I'd love to hear your own thoughts about how you're connecting what we're exploring here with that lecture cycle and any others. And then to make his point once more, drive it home even further, he brings this example from a philosopher whose last name is Spencer, who's describing the situation that he thinks conveys how one comes to a conceptual explanation. He describes the scenario where someone's walking and they hear a noise and they generalize from their prior experience that this noise must be the effect of a certain creature, and that all of this is gained through just those observations. But Steiner says, no, 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 actually, you're presupposing cause and effect itself when you say that it's actually the case that your observations have kicked up thinking such that it has provided the concepts of cause and effect, which then you rely upon in order to make any connection between the sound that is made and the creature who made it, the cause. But again, we don't ever perceive through our senses cause and effect. That's supplied by thinking to meet the prior observation or prior experience. As Steiner writes, observation evokes thinking, and it is thinking that first shows me how to link one separate experience to another. And so again, I think it's nice to think about observation and thinking as this processual continuum. And then further on, Steiner declares, human consciousness is the stage upon which concept and observation meet and become linked to one another. In saying this, we have in fact characterized this human consciousness. It is the mediator between thinking and observation. And as the mediator of these two activities, we become self-conscious. As Steiner writes, because we direct our thinking upon our observation, we have consciousness of objects. Because we direct it upon ourselves, we have consciousness of ourselves, or self-consciousness. Human consciousness must of necessity be at the same time self-consciousness, because it is a consciousness that thinks. For when thinking contemplates its own activity, it makes its own essential being as subject into a thing, as object. And then in one of the most often quoted parts of the book, a really beautiful part of the book, where Steiner's continuity with pre-modern philosophers, though in a different way, like Plato and Aristotle, who held that there was some kind of ontic logos or cosmic thinking that humans participate in, Steiner says that even though human subjects participate in thinking and are thereby self-conscious because of that participation, thinking actually lies beyond subject and object. He says it produces these two concepts just as it produces all others. When, therefore, I, as thinking subject, refer a concept to an object, we must not regard this reference as something purely subjective. It is not the subject that makes the reference, but thinking. The subject does not think because it is a subject, rather, it appears to itself as a subject because it can think. The activity exercised by man or the human being as a thinking being is thus not merely subjective. Rather, is it something neither subjective nor objective, which transcends both these concepts. So we could say it's trans-subjective or trans-objective. It's what mediates between them. It's something we participate in. It's something that is a part of the cosmos. The world is word-like, you could say, in that it is both image or something that we can perceive through our senses, and also has this conceptual aspect of it that allows us to understand it, much like the words on a page. There's the marks that we perceive, and then there's the meaning that is the conceptual relations between the words that we contribute because we are literate. I ought never to say that my individual subject thinks, but much more that my individual subject lives by the grace of thinking, writes Steiner. Thinking is thus an element that leads me out beyond myself and connects me with the objects, but at the same time it separates me from them, inasmuch as it sets me as subject over against them. So again, thinking is this activity that we creatures, we as human beings, can participate in, and it's part of our rift from being one with the natural world, as we see our many creaturely kin exhibiting in their more simple relationship to the world, more harmonious relationship to the world. But we also have this potential to consciously reunite with the world through knowing it, through a participatory form of knowing, not just a kind of abstract, armchair, hyper intellectual way of knowing. This more dynamic, participatory approach to knowing, Steiner thought, in his later writings, is more akin to something like clairvoyance. So we've spent a lot of time talking about thinking and what thinking is and how it's something that we participate in, yet also have to willfully activate. There's something paradoxical about that. But then what is that directed at? Objects, of course, but how do those come into our awareness? Steiner says that's the next question to ask. He says, in order to answer this question, we must eliminate from our field of observation everything that has been imported by thinking. And then a little bit further, we must imagine that a being with fully developed human intelligence originates out of nothing and confronts the world. So this is a thought experiment. It's just for the purposes of clarifying the process of getting to know the world, but we never experience the world like this because we're always starting somewhere with experience. As he goes on, what it would be aware of before it sets its thinking in motion would be the pure content of observation, which is not an actual experience. But for the sake of trying to understand this process, we can abstractly describe it or imagine it. The world would then appear to this being as nothing but a mere disconnected aggregate of objects of sensation, so just chaos. Colors, sounds, sensations of pressure, of warmth, of taste and smell, also feelings of pleasure and pain. This aggregate is the content of pure unthinking observation. So just like chaos, like we wouldn't be able to recognize anything, there would be no understanding of the world. It would just appear as a bunch of forces and objects and with no clear relation to each other or to us. And so just for the sake of being able to clearly distinguish between thinking activity and what thinking activity is brought to before it's saturated those objects of observation and then allows us to recognize them as things. For example, in the image, without the concepts of duck and rabbit, for instance, this would appear like chaos and would just be the pure percept. So let's pretend that none of us knew the concept duck or rabbit. We would not know what we were looking at. That would be the pure percept. As Steiner says, it is then not the process of observation, but the object of observation, which I call the percept. So that's one of the concepts that he's going to be working with throughout the text and has been already. But here he's like clearly describing what he means by that. And again, as we touched upon in the last chapter, objects of observation can include prior thoughts. So a thought could be a percept as well. It doesn't just have to be something we perceive through our senses, as could a feeling or an act of will. And if thinking is kicked up by observation, the more that we experience, the more observations that we collect, the more we have to continually correct our initial percept of the world itself, our understanding, our picture of the world as we go. And Steiner says this is also the case for humankind throughout history, if we conceive of humankind as one whole process. So he says, every extension of the circle of my percepts compels me to correct my picture of the world. We see this in everyday life as well in the spiritual development of humankind. And so throughout the text, Steiner will refer to the naive person or naive realism, which is just this idea that the world is just how we experience it. So the sun revolves around the earth, for example, is a naive understanding of what the world appears to be to our senses until further along in human history, when there has been centuries of conceptual reflection on different aspects of the relationship between the sun and the earth, and a correction of the world percept is arrived at that then encourages us to eventually distrust what is disclosed by the senses. But then Steiner asks, how is it that we are compelled to make these continual corrections to our observations? Why is it? And he says it's because we're limited. We're limited both spatially, we're always limited by our place of observation. And he describes this as the mathematical limitation of our position, qualitatively, as he describes, according to our physiological, organismic, sense perceiving, and cultural constitution. And this is something he'll riff on more in later chapters. Perception is very subjective, but it's thinking which can help us reach for a more universal or a consensus of understanding between our uniquely situated experience or perception, because we're all embodied differently. We all have different experiences. And then when we think of humanity across the centuries, across millennia, we're all occupying a different cultural, historical moment. And this acknowledgement that perception, for instance, that perception of color depends upon an organism, and the human spirit corresponding to it has an eye to perceive the color, has led philosophers like George Berkeley to articulate a metaphysics that assumes the world of our experience is sheerly made up of mental pictures and that objects are only there when there's a subject to perceive it. And Steiner's not satisfied by this because he wants our mental pictures to correspond to something real in the world so that we could have actual knowledge of the world, however limited and provisional it might be, at least for the time being, provisional. Steiner says that the views like Berkeley's are fine if what we are focused on is sheerly that the fact that our organization contributes something to what is perceived. But in order to get more insight into the actual things in themselves that correspond to our mental pictures, we have to ask more about what happens to us in this process. So as Steiner writes, in the process of perception, I perceive not only other things, but also myself. The percept of myself contains, to begin with, the fact that I am the stable element in contrast to the continual coming and going of the percept pictures. So this is a potential. We could become conscious of ourselves in the act of perception, that at the same time that we're looking at a fern, we can include within our observation of the fern our self-observation of ourself observing the fern. But we don't usually add ourselves to our observations unless we're very self-conscious and in some kind of social situation. Then we're very aware of it, right? But if we were to add to our observation of a tree the observation of ourselves observing the tree, Steiner says, I then do not merely see a tree, but I also know that it is I who am seeing it. I know, moreover, that something happens in me while I am observing the tree. When the tree disappears from my field of vision, an after effect of this process remains in my consciousness, a picture of the tree. This observation has become associated with myself during observation. Myself has become enriched. Its content has absorbed a new element. The element I call my mental picture of the tree. I should never have occasion to speak of mental pictures did I not experience them in the percept of my own self. So Steiner now is introducing mental pictures again, and also this notion of the self-percept, which is modified by our observation of objects outside of us. And that's how we can know that there is something out there that corresponds to our mental pictures of them, because there's a change in us that corresponds to something about them that is essential to them. And this is a good place for another footnote with respect to Waldorf education, because as is exemplified by the main lesson books where students in the teacher training have to, instead of just referring to textbook, create your own textbook based on what is being learned. And so by doing that, you're working with this perceptual process that Steiner describes, where in attending to what is being learned, you're internalizing a mental picture and doing it even more so when you create some kind of external artifact, a kind of external mental picture of that. And as well, just in the emphasis on, again, leading students through experiences or observations or actually creating something, writing a poem before reflecting on it conceptually, because then they have something in them already that has latent within it the concepts that you can then draw out of them as teachers, rather than trying to give them the concepts prematurely. Because if they have no experience corresponding to it, how can they actually assimilate those concepts? So continuing with this question regarding how we know there is a world of things in themselves out there that correspond to our mental picture, Steiner says, I perceive the mental picture of what was experienced of the thing in itself in myself in the same sense as I perceive color, sound, etc. in other objects. I am now also able to distinguish these other objects that confront me by calling them the outer world, whereas the content of my percept of myself I call my inner world, which is modified and expanded and enriched the more experiences that we have. And then Steiner goes on to be critical of philosophers like Kant, who have overemphasized the modification or the mental picture that arises in our relationship with the world at the expense of the objects that correspond to those mental pictures that enable them to be there in the first place. And so remember that Kant, one of Kant's concerns was to articulate a philosophy that was in accord with the new discoveries being made by modern science and the skepticism regarding the value of human subjectivity and sense perception in the pursuit of knowledge, especially given the fact that the Copernican revolution, where there was a slow embrace of the idea that the Earth actually revolves around the sun rather than the other way around, which was what many for thousands of years believed based on their experience, their naive realism. Kant tries to transpose this into a characterization of the process of knowledge by claiming that all we can really claim to know with confidence is our mental pictures. And even though Kant's philosophy was more sophisticated in its recognition that there is this conceptual element that is supplied in the act of perception by the human mind, later reductionist oriented scientists and philosophers informed by them would claim that what's really going on is not what we experience, but are either interactions at the level of particles as described by physics or various processes of our organism as described by physiologists, that these processes are what is really real. But all of this presupposes that the sense organs themselves are fundamental in the same way that the naive realist would have believed that the eye really sees the sun as it is, for instance. Summarizing this view with respect to observation of a trumpet, Steiner writes, "My brain conveys to me singly and by widely different paths the visual, tactile, and auditory sensations which the soul then combines into the mental picture of a trumpet. It is just this very last link in a process, the mental picture of the trumpet, which for my consciousness is the very first thing that is given. In it, nothing can any longer be found of what exists outside me and originally made an impression on my senses. The external object has been entirely lost on the way to the brain and through the brain to the soul." So the claim here is that what we think is going on in the process of perceiving the world and attempting to know it by thinking about it is actually not really the true world at all. But then Steiner says, wait a second, what about the sense organs? Are they not also percepts? Because just as we're aware of the things that we perceive through our sense organs, we're also aware through observation, through perception, that there are sense organs, which we have mental pictures of. So as Steiner writes, I must henceforth treat the table, of which formerly I believed that it acted on me and produced a mental picture of itself in me as itself a mental picture. But from this it follows logically that my sense organs and the processes in them are also merely subjective. I have no right to speak of a real I, but only of my mental picture of the I. Exactly the same is true of the nerve paths and the brain process, and no less of the process in the soul itself, through which things are supposed to be built up out of the chaos of manifold sensations. If, assuming the truth of the circle of argumentation, I run through the steps of the act of my cognition once more, the latter reveals itself as a tissue of mental pictures, which, as such, cannot act on one another. I cannot say that my mental picture of the objects acts on my mental picture of the eye, and that from this interaction my mental picture of color results. Nor is it necessary that I should say this, for as soon as I see clearly that my sense organs and their activity, my nerve and soul processes, can also be known to me only through perception, the train of thought which I have outlined reveals itself in its full absurdity. So further on in future chapters, Steiner will say we can't explain percepts by reference to other percepts. We can only explain the relationship between percepts. And so there's this whole chain of percepts that he's describing, from the objects that are perceived without to the sense organs that perceive them to the processes that then somehow take a leap into what we experience, or at least correspond to them in our soul experience. These are all percepts, but they can only be explained in their interconnection by thinking. But again, we have to think about thinking as in a continuum with perception or observation. And so of critical idealism, which is this view that Steiner associates with Kant, philosophies that are based on the criticism of naive realism, or this idea that, or the perspective that what you see is what you get, that the sun revolves around the earth. Critical idealism thinks of itself as advancing beyond that in claiming that actually the world is just our mental picture. We don't really experience things as they are, but it presupposes in a kind of naive realist fashion that the sense organs aren't mental pictures, but they also are. It wants to prove, writes Steiner of critical idealism, that percepts have the character of mental pictures by naively accepting the percepts connected with one's own organism as objectively valid facts. And over and above this, it fails to see that it confuses two spheres of observation between which it can find no connection. And so Steiner closes the chapter with this refutation, claiming that because this variant of critical idealism refuses to stay within thinking in its effort to explain things, but instead attempts to explain perceptions through other perceptions, that it can't offer a satisfactory answer to the question as to what the relationship is between our mental pictures and the objects of perception, or the things in themselves that they correspond to. So that's enough for now. I hope it was helpful, and I look forward to exploring the subsequent chapters with you all later on in spring. See you soon.